You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our guest on, Dan Holler, who is the Communications Director of Heritage Action for America and a good friend of the program. And I want to welcome Dan back to the program. Dan, welcome, and I hope you had a very nice 4th of July holiday.
Hey, thanks, guys. It was great. How was yours?
It was actually it was great. I haven't done this in a long time, but my fiance and I, we went to Philadelphia. I mean, we go to Philadelphia often, but not on 4th of July. And I stayed at a hotel which was literally right on the corner from Independence Hall, and it was a very nice place, a lot of people. Just the weather, it was hot, but it was beautiful. And we just had a great time walking through all the different museums and exhibits and things like that. And the hotel was fantastic. I was actually pleasantly surprised. Very nice staff. Food was great. We enjoyed walking around Philadelphia. But I got a crazy story to tell you, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
Oh, okay, I heard it clicking. Okay. So we went to see the fireworks, and there were so many people. It was incredible. There were... I mean, it could have been at least 1 million people. I don't know how many people come out, but it was just an enormous amount of people, if you could figure a large part of the city gathering to go see the fireworks. So we're trying to find a place where we could see them, and we're patiently waiting. Of course, they start about an hour late. And then finally, once they started, we realized we had to move to see them better. So we moved up a little bit, and we're watching it. And about a couple minutes into it, all of a sudden we hear this, like, really weird noise, and we turn around and we see a mob of people, thousands of people just running towards us. And it was like the running of the bulls, but just thousands of people. And I just grabbed Margot and pushed her behind me and turned my body sideways with my elbow up to defend ourselves as I was trying to, like, move her to safety. And it was just a herd of people running from what was gunshots. And so
it's certainly an exciting way to spend 4th of July.
Oh, it was incredible. So, yeah, I mean, so you end up with some sort of a shooting that actually happened where we were standing earlier. So it's good that we moved. But somehow it was just amazing. I mean, we were okay, but there were some older people and some women and whatnot around us that actually got hurt, knocked into bushes, knocked over into trees. I mean, it was incredible, really amazing. And so I guess I was glad I didn't bring my children this time around because that definitely would have been more frightening for me. But, yeah, it was pretty amazing. But other than that, it was a great, great weekend.
The city of brotherly love is so welcoming, you know?
It's not like New York. You know, I'm not a big fan of New York City because I don't think it's that clean. But New York is definitely a pretty safe city. Philadelphia, I don't know. But, yeah, it was great, though. I recommend anyone who loves the Constitution, loves, American history, it's definitely a great place to go see, just like D.C. I mean, there's so many. I think you can walk around D.C. every single day and find something you didn't notice before and learn something new. It's a pretty wild place. But, of course, we didn't bring you here to talk about our vacations and our good old times, but we'll get back to what's going on in Washington, D.C. Congress is back from their short vacation, and they've got some important things to deal with. But what do you think they're going to start with first?
Yeah, you know, you never can tell what's going to happen in Washington, and they have some sort of real milquetoast bills up to start off the week, nothing too exciting. And, you know, whenever that happens, typically things are going on behind the scenes. So the things to look for is there's going to be a big conference tomorrow within the House Republicans. They're going to meet to decide what the path forward is on immigration. Unclear how that's going to turn out, but there's obviously people in the Republican Party who really want to push an amnesty bill. They think that's smart politics. They think it's the right thing to do for, you know, winning future national elections and such, sort of the Karl Rove line. That's going to happen on Wednesday. At the same time, they're trying to figure out how to get a farm bill passed. Remember, that failed back at the end of June in the House because Republicans defected because it's 80% food stamp spending as opposed to spending, which is egregious corporate welfare as it is. But And then you also have this whole student loan thing going on. So student loan rates increased on July 1st. Nobody really knows about it. It's only going to cost students $7 extra a month whenever they go back to pay their loans. So it's not really a big deal, but it costs taxpayers a lot of money to keep the lower rates. So they're working out a deal on that. So, again, a lot of stuff going on behind closed doors, and I think we'll start to see a trickling out of this stuff as this week moves on and certainly into next week.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I always thought the Farm Bill, I'll take that one up first, they should actually break that down into subcomponents, and I think that the votes would be much different. And because you're right, when you're spending 80% on food programs that really don't have all that much to do with farming. Now, they may support farms that if they're supplying the food, but to me, it's a large area of social programming that we should be having a discussion on, and not harming members of Congress because who are in farm country at least, because they don't support spending money in that way. And so it should be two separate issues.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and it's something that Heritage Action has been pushing to do for a while. And there's actually talk in the House now about splitting the two up. So you'll have your farming components into one bill, you have your food stamps in another bill. Now, here's the problem, though, right? We want to see them split apart because that allows us to have a real conversation about what is good policy and what is bad policy. What they're talking about doing in the House is saying, well, let's split them up and just vote on a bunch of bad policy separately and hope we can get to a conference committee with the Senate bill so it can pass the same old status quo. That's not exactly what conservative reform folks had in mind. So they got half of it right, but in typical Washington fashion, it looks like they're trying to mess up what could be an awesome victory.
Well, I guess it's called cover, isn't it?
That's exactly right. They'll go and say, hey, conservatives, you wanted these bills split up. We did that. You should be so happy. And the response for anybody who's being rational about this is, no, not really. We wanted good policy. And the only way to get good policy is to split these two apart. But taking a different path to financial ruin doesn't make us any happier.
Now, what I don't understand, Dan, is that there are a lot of bills that get introduced or even amendments that get introduced which may not have anything to do with the bill that's going on, but they get introduced and they're not passed. I mean, a lot of people, how many times have we tried to repeal health care? I mean, it may pass in the House, but how many different jobs bills or different ideas of jobs bills were introduced that actually never even got voted upon? So what's the big deal about coming up with an idea and saying, you know what, it's not a good idea, we're not going to do it. Let's fix it so we get enough votes to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a reason you have these programs on the book, and you certainly want to do stuff to reform them. But at the same time, you don't want to do something that makes the problem worse, or, and in this case, I guess, locks in a bunch of bad policy for the next 5 years. And that's really the thing. You have lawmakers in Washington and all the special interest groups will say, well, if we don't do something, bad stuff will happen. Well, it's really bad to lock in policy that's terrible and costs taxpayers a lot of money for half a decade. And that's sort of the rub, and it's something that we need to break the habit of in Washington and say, if you're not going to pass good policy, don't pass anything at all.
Right. Now, you brought up the student loan and interest rate issue that never really got resolved, so it just automatically went to what the law dictated. And to me, I don't want college education is not a guaranteed right by any constitution, any real law. It's a matter of, somebody wants to further their education or their qualifications to create a better job, a life for themselves or a future, then they increase their skills in their education and they pay for it on their own. And so I think the government's actually doing a pretty nice thing here by offering loans in the first place. Now, if you go buy a car and you're a young person or even a house, interest rates years ago, before we decided we weren't going to have interest rates, used to be very high. I mean, I remember in the 70s and the 80s, it was anywhere between 15 and 20-something% to take out a mortgage. And, of course, people still buy cars today. They pay 10 and 15% interest. So to be able to get a government loan or government-backed loan where you can borrow, anywhere, in a neighborhood of, I don't know, 50, 80, 100 or more $1,000 to pay for your education, and then pay it back when you get a job and be able to make arrangements so you're paying such a small amount back and could essentially pay it off forever. I think that that's a pretty fair deal. So I'm just curious, like, what the big deal is. And you said it yourself. The increased price isn't that great. But the other thing, Dan, is that it seems to me that the Democrats wanted really no part of fixing this problem, and I'm not sure why.
Well, it's really interesting to go through and watch this. And typically what you have in Washington is arguments over process and policy tend to flip-flop depending on who's in power. And last year during the election, you had President Obama go out there and say, hey, student loan rates are doubling. It's going to hurt young voters, is what he meant when he said students. It's going to hurt young students, hurt people who are trying to get an education. Republicans are being mean. They don't like you, and they're trying to block this. And Republicans caved and, extended the low rate. And it was the president who was demagoguing and using the issue for political gain. Now you have Republicans, they passed a bill to not necessarily extend the 3.4% interest rate, but peg it to a low rate based on Treasury yields, sort of this wonky technical stuff that really isn't a free market necessarily, and we really don't know how much it'll cost taxpayers, but they did something. So now they're out there demagoguing the president and Democrats saying, hey, they don't care about students, they don't care about young voters, and the whole thing is flipped on its head, and it's just this cynicism in Washington, I guess, where you have both sides who are more than willing to play it against each other.
And the other big thing that we really should mention, and I know you have and we have as well, is the fact that I believe it's about, 1.5% of that increase is going to pay for Obamacare?
Yeah, and that's the part that gets overlooked in this whole entire conversation, is that basically what happened during Obamacare, during these reconciliation instructions, they needed money, so they basically took over the student loan industry with Obamacare. And now basically if you're trying to get a student loan, you're going through the federal government, and they're the de facto provider. And it's great to talk about what the interest rate should be, take it to this or that. But really, we need to get the federal government out of the student loan industry. They have no business being in there. It's a cost to the taxpayers. It's a risk to the taxpayers. And there's no reasonable response to say, why is the government involved in this?
No, that's a good point. And so our last thing that I want to cover here today, which is I think really just absolutely appalling, and that is we have another act of Congress. Unfortunately, I mean, not that we favor this bill, but Obamacare was passed. It is law, and as law gets implemented, I don't see where the president has a right to say, well, as we're finding a problem with this law, I'm going to give or delay penalties for these people who I favor over another group. So one, what authority does the president have to even do that? And I don't understand how one group is being treated differently or more favorably than another with this law. To me, that alone is illegal.
Well, I mean, Congress is certainly going to look into it, investigate it, and I think they should. But really, I think we need to look broader. What you've seen is the Obama administration has basically acknowledged their law doesn't work, that it was poorly written, poorly designed, poorly implemented, and it cannot possibly succeed. And Republicans need to seize on this and say, you know what, we tried, they failed, they can't implement their own law, it's time to get rid of it. And they need to use every vehicle they can legislatively to try to defund and repeal the law to make sure it doesn't go further along the implementation line. Like you said, they've been more than content to pick and choose who is spared from the law, who isn't. It's unclear that they have legal authority to do any of this, but they're going to do it anyway. So there is a real onus that should be one for House Republicans to say, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to give you guys, we're not going to allow you guys to keep picking winners and losers despite what you had written in the law.
Right. Well, I agree with you completely. I mean, I think the Supreme Court had this wrong. Roberts had it wrong in his decision on it, but it is the law, and I think the best thing to do is just to repeal the whole thing in its entirety. And if you're going to fix anything, then come up with the things that really need to be addressed and do it in a sensible way that doesn't cost us too much money. But that being said, when I look at this act by the president, it's not the first time. I just don't understand why the Congress doesn't take real serious action in stopping an agency from really going rogue or a president from going rogue. Because I think that's the biggest problem. You have these checks and balances in place, but too often I think you see either Congress setting up something so the executive could just do it and it's off their hands, and then they never follow through with ensuring that it's following law, or you have a judiciary that it will either make a poor decision or write its own laws, or pitch it back to some lower court that made a poor decision to begin with. I mean, I don't know. It's just I find that so many things going on are just way beyond what we had expected when we founded this nation, when we charted the course for what type of government we were going to be. And I think that the ongoing problems that we face today are because we haven't addressed it last decade, the decade before, or even a month ago, for that matter.
You're exactly right, and one of the things is that part of this is Congress's own fault, and they constantly delegate power to the executive and say, you have discretion over this and that, you can write these regulations that dictate this. Part of it is because they're making the conscious choice to give away their power, and they can't reasonably expect that if they continue to give away power that the executive branch isn't going to try to take more and more and more. And I don't think this is necessarily a Republican or a Democrat thing. This is the two institutions fighting over power, or I guess in this case, one institution giving and another taking. And this is sort of the natural ebb and flow, and it would happen, I think, regardless of which party was in power versus not. And at some point, you're going to have these folks come up and say, in Congress, these folks say, all right, enough is enough. We're going to try to reclaim the power that the founders gave us.
Well, I think that would be a good thing, because I thought that what was beautiful about the initial government that we set up was that perfect checks and balances, and the fact that if you really had a divided government, it meant that really nothing would happen. And in this case, what we see is we see really nothing happening, but in such a negative way, because it's so expensive. Because they just, we're not going to really let this bill happen, so we'll screw up the way we do 10 other things and not letting it happen. You know what I'm saying? I just think we're dodging actually dealing with issues and spending a lot of money doing it.
That's right, because Washington's default is, hey, we'll at least just spend a little money and say we've done something and let the executive and the bureaucrats figure it all out, and that's what's been going on for a long time. And unless Congress decides to reassert their authority, it'll continue.
And I'll give you a perfect example. Take the EPA. Look at cap and trade. Congress said, okay, we're not going to, after we had to twist their arms, right, because we had a lot of Republicans who were supporting that. Not a lot, but enough. So once we were able to get rid of cap and trade, then you see the EPA step in and probably doing more or as equally damaging things as the cap and trade bill would have done. But Congress isn't stepping up and saying, hey, we made it clear that we weren't going to do this. You don't have the right to, decide what industry is going to fold and what industry is going to be successful because of the laws that you're passing there. And that's an example here.
No, and it goes on throughout various branches of government, and at some point, Congress needs to step in and say, we are not going to allow you to pass all these regulations that destroy the economy. We are going to put the blame back on ourselves if you do this. And that's really what it comes down to, is that members of Congress can wash their hands and say, oh, it wasn't us, it was those bureaucrats. And, it was the bureaucrats, but you're empowering them. And, you can do it through congressional funding measures and cut them off. You can have the fight there, or you can pass and change the way that regulations are written and implemented.
Yeah, that's right. So, Dan, if you had to guess on this immigration bill, are we going to have a bill, or are we going to fight over this for a bunch more months?
No, I think we're still a long ways away, and the House may very well do something small, and then the real question becomes: are they going to take it to conference and try to hammer out an agreement with the Amnesty First bill in the Senate? And that's really the ball game, and I don't think we have a real clear picture as to what their strategy is yet.
Yeah, and I hold my breath when I think of the leadership and hope that they just could stay strong on one of these issues. Because quite frankly, when I go back to what happened with the Obamacare, it was the Republican senators that allowed that bill to even come to the floor for the initial vote. And then, of course, once it came to the House, you knew it was going to pass. But I think in this case, it's the House where we could stand their ground on at least coming up with some reasonable, smaller reforms if that's the path we choose, but it doesn't have to be amnesty. So hopefully we stay strong.
Yeah, I hope so, and hopefully they actually start focusing on issues that matter to the American people. Immigration isn't really a hot button issue for most law-abiding Americans. The EPA destroying 500,000 jobs, that's a pretty serious issue. You can go on down the line and find issues that are of more importance to Americans than immigration right now.
That's a great point. Anyway, Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and could you please give the website for Heritage Action so people can go check you guys out?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just heritageaction.com.
Excellent. Again, Dan Holler, Communications Director with Heritage Action. Thank you so much, Dan. We'll talk to you soon.
Hey, thanks a lot. Have a good one.
All right, take care.